he called it what? Righteous and benevolent. Okay. And then burst out laughing so hard he couldn't continue. Yeah. No, I didn't see that coming. Okay. Bye. January 13th, 1952. Should there be an armistice, you do not want the other side breaking it. So maybe you threaten that should they do so, you will retaliate with a larger general war. That's your deterrent. But what if you don't have the force to back it up? I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the new year began, but it was mostly a continuation of 1951. Both sides sitting around the negotiating table, unable to agree on things like what to do with POWs, and both sides in the field holed up in their winter defenses, launching nothing larger than skirmishes. The sub-delegations of the Peace Talks Committee continue to meet this week about the repatriation of prisoners, whether they be military or civilian. At this point, Ruthven Libby is trying to dispel some of the hostility from Lee Sang-cho, which we saw last week, by trying to more carefully and thoroughly explain the UN proposal from January 2nd. This fails, and in fact, Lee becomes more hostile and even abusive in his attacks on not just the proposal, but against the UN command, South Korean President Syngman Rhee, and Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek. And Libby points out, as his side has done before, that it's pretty inconsistent for the communist side to oppose voluntary repatriation when they were the ones who introduced and first practiced it in Korea in the first place. Lee had no hesitation in accusing the UN command of educating the POWs politically to influence their choice, even though he had admitted at an earlier meeting the communists had re-educated many UNC prisoners and then released them at the front. On the other hand, even Lee could see the somewhat distorted humor in his own arguments at times. At the meeting on the 11th of January, as he defended the communist system of prisoner education and called it righteous and benevolent, he became so convulsed with laughter that he could scarcely finish his remarks. Libby charges that the communists forced thousands of ROK, South Korean, soldiers taken prisoners into their ranks, and Lee denies it. He also says with a straight face that only volunteers can serve in the communist forces. Libby stresses the advantages that the communists would get going along with the UN proposal, but Lee is way too skeptical of this to bite. I mean, come on. The UN command is not going to be doing any favors for the communists. Wouldn't that just be betraying their own interests? I'm not sure how that makes sense, but well, there it is. Libby is asked to confirm whether Chinese POWs would be allowed to choose between going back to communist China or nationalist China. And he says, that's the UN proposal, yeah. And Tsai Ching-wen takes issue with this. He says that the Chinese people won't tolerate it. But when asked several times, he refuses to say whether he speaks for the Chinese volunteers in Korea or all of the Chinese people. Well, as you may remember, the POW issue is item 4 on the truce talks agenda. There are still discussions having to do with item 3, though. The main issues are still whether airfields would be able to be rebuilt after an armistice, the issue of the rotation in and out of troops, who would make up a neutral nations observer team, and how many ports would be allowed to handle whatever rotation and replenishment of men and supplies is agreed upon. Henry Hodes had been running this part of things for the UN, but he got a new assignment in December, so Claude Fernbaugh replaced him, taking over the pleasure of dealing with the very talented Xi Feng. In late December, the Communist Party side was pretty adamant about refusing restrictions on the post-armistice construction or reconstruction of airfields in North Korea, and the UN side was pretty adamant that there be such restrictions. Apparently, at sessions on the 20th and 22nd of December, General Xi hinted that if the UN would relent on the airfield issue, then his side would relent on the rotation and replenishment issue. But those hints did not fall on fertile ground. The UN did make a concession that I mentioned briefly last time. They said that they would not insist on aerial observation and photo recon if the communists would accept airfield restrictions. Xi accepted the concession but refused to budge on the airfields, which seemed to validate UN Chief Delegate Turner Joy and UN Commander Matt Ridgway's often repeated warnings against giving the enemy something for nothing. Before you ask, She told Joy, "You want to sit on other people's heads, and when you come down from that position, you say that it is a concession on your part." He actually said that last week, implying the UN was just pulling back from an unreasonable position, an untenable one, rather than offering something of value. Joy says the UN giving in on that is just hardening the other side's determination to get a concession on the Airfields issue. The communists were well advised on this score, for during the latter part of December, there had been a steady deterioration in the United Nations resolution to insist upon a strict limitation of airfield construction and rehabilitation. This could be traced to the growing reliance on the part of the United States upon a broader sanction declaration to be issued as soon as an armistice was signed. That too, I talked about last week, a UN declaration that breaking the armistice would result in broader retaliation against communist China. But shifting emphasis from local control in China to the possibility of a larger war makes the airfield issue less important, especially when you add in the difficulty or perhaps impossibility of actually preventing the enemy from building and rebuilding airfields once the armistice is in effect. Ridgway, as we've seen, is quite concerned. I mean, if UN air power is static or decreased, and the enemy is allowed or able to increase his after an armistice, well, then how would the UN or the US be able to be much of a deterrent to renewed hostilities? He wants to stand firm on the issue, but this week on the 10th, Washington tells him that if this issue became the only obstacle to an armistice, then he must give in and not prohibit airfield construction or reconstruction. But of course, don't concede on this until such time as the other side actually says it's a breaking point. As a suggestion, they urge that the delegations settle all other matters under items 3, 4, and 5 and defer further discussions of airfields until then. At that time, the UN command could drop the airfields requirement if the communists would sign the armistice. In this way, they argued, the concession could soon be followed by the UN declaration, including the broader sanction of an expanded war. The issuance of the declaration should counteract the propaganda value that the enemy might attempt to gain from the UNC retreat on airfields. Okay, Ridgway has serious misgivings, but agrees. Pushing the airfields issue aside till later is okay with him. But he thinks the other side might refuse to take up something new until that is dealt with. The other side is getting their new counterproposal ready. So in the meantime, it's business as usual between Shea and Joy and Fehrenbach. When the latter bring up the airfields things, Shea's mantra becomes no interference in internal affairs. Turner wonders whose sovereign rights Shea is actually interested in, since the North Korean Air Force is nothing right now. North Korea's or China's? Well, on the 9th, the communist delegation gives their new version for an item 3 settlement that is actually a bunch closer to the UN objectives. Joy still attacks what he sees as weak spots and omissions. He doesn't understand, he says, why if the communists are willing to allow observation teams from neutral nations in to inspect behind the lines, which is clearly interference in internal affairs, why they won't allow airfield restrictions. She says, no inconsistency here. This version has no restrictions on airfields, but does allow replenishment of military personnel, weapons, and equipment, as long as there's no actual increase. This has been a UN thing from the get-go, so Joy takes a page from the other side's book and calls it no concession, just the recognition of how fair and reasonable the UN position has been. The UN does not, however, accept the proposal because of the airfield thing, but areas of dispute are growing smaller and smaller, and that's a good thing. A couple words about the proposed post-armistice UN declaration that should the other side break it, it would lead to large-scale hostilities versus China. U.S. Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins points out to the Joint Chiefs of Staff January 10th. The very fact that the proposed UN declaration did not necessarily restrict a future outbreak of hostilities to Korea posed a new set of circumstances. Under the recent NSC decision, which I talked about last week, the ROK forces would be increased, trained, and equipped to assume the responsibility for the defense of their own territory. Depending on conditions at the time, the United States might or might not intervene again in Korea if the communists violated an armistice agreement. But of course, they have to get to an armistice agreement in the first place, and the UN side is trying any way they can. Operation Strangle has been in action for many months now. This is the campaign to destroy the enemy's logistics, wrecking his supply lines. Of course, when the truce talks restarted in October and the active war ground to a halt, this interdiction campaign really became top priority. Destroying enemy equipment and transport would ideally prevent the buildup of enough reserve stock to mount any major offensive. And messing up supply lines, well, even with the enemy giving the men minimum requirements, supplying 750,000 men is a massive challenge at the best of times. The past few months, the UN planes have averaged 9,000 or so sorties a month by both Air Force and Navy pilots, really aiming for the North Korean railroads. Medium bombers hit marshalling yards, light bombers hit main supply routes by night, and fighters and fighter bombers go after the actual trains themselves and vehicular traffic. On November 18th, carrier-based planes began a program of rail and bridge destruction, with naval recon jets dropping 500-kilo loads. Within a couple weeks, it took the other side 3 days to repair railroad damage that took just 1 day to repair earlier. But even so, railroad traffic continues to flow. Interdiction has made transportation more difficult, but still not impossible. One reason for the failure of Strangle to live up to the expectations of the optimistic codename was the ingenuity of the enemy in devising countermeasures to negate the interdiction program. At the key railroad junction at Suncheon, northeast of Pyongyang, pilots reported in early November that the railroad bridge was still out of service since 2 spans were missing. It was only after a night photo was taken that the UN command discovered the communists brought up removable spans each night and had been using the bridge right along. Ridgway sends his assessment to the Joint Chiefs. He believes they have really slowed down enemy supply operations and increased the time it takes to get things to the front, yes. They've also diverted personnel and material from the front to protect and maintain their lines of communications and supply, yes. All this is great, but as long as defense conditions remain static, the enemy still can supply himself, and the UN air power as it is just not strong enough to stop that. Furthermore, although it might take some time, the enemy is still capable of stockpiling forces and supplies. What Ridgway is saying is that unless there is a change in the situation that requires the enemy to use more supplies and expend more ammunition, then eventually they will be in a position to launch and maintain a large-scale offensive. Hanson Baldwin, who covers the Korean War for the New York Times, wrote this back in November. Operation Strangle has not strangled, and the ground battlefront is virtually stabilized. There is no such thing as real isolation or interdiction on any continental battlefield by air power. The enemy's supply lines can be cut finally and irretrievably only when ground forces are firmly astride them. But just the attempts sure sound impressive. On the 12th, U.S. Sabre jets on patrol discover 3 enemy trains, each heading for the security of a tunnel. The jets blast the opening of the tunnel and collapse it to block passage. Afterwards, the trains are raked by fire from the planes. The attack destroys some boxcars and 2 of the 3 locomotives. In other activity, the Air Force initiates a 2-day mission to destroy a strategic enemy bridge. The super fortresses based on Okinawa continue to strike the railway bridge that spans the Chongchon River east of Sinanju. The bridge is damaged heavily and rendered out of service following the delivery of 396 500-pound high-explosive bombs. Like I said, it does sound impressive. Well, that is the week. Strangle continues. Also, Phase 3 of the anti-guerrilla Operation Rat Killer is in action this week, but I don't have reports yet, which I imagine I'll get in the near future. And the talks continue with restrictions on airfields and POW issues dominating them. Back to Ridgway for a second. He does not believe that post-armistice, his command, as it is, can carry out much in the way of full retribution against the Chinese should they break it. He is also not expecting significant reinforcements and is pretty sure that the Chinese will build up their forces. So what would a warning achieve? I read in James Golden's Korea, The Untold Story, that this week on the 7th, Ridgway asks the Joint Chiefs of Staff if they understand the implications of such a warning, writing this to them. In my opinion, the retributive potentiality of UN military power against Red China would be non-effective unless the full results of precipitating World War III were to be accepted and the use of atomic weapons authorized. World War III, that's a scary thought. Here in 1952, just a few years after the last one. Well, whatever they decide and whatever happens, I will be here to cover it. You can count on that, and I can do so thanks to the Time Ghost Army. You too should join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com, for it is the army that allows all of this. Be part of the adventure. Jason Bennett is the Army Member of the Week here, and these are the newest commissioned officers, and do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time. I think my chair was sinking throughout that episode. I think it was getting lower. I seem to remember sitting up like this high at the beginning.